Hello, student. Come along, child. Destination unknown.
I'm going to tell you my life story, and there's several parts to it. I grew up on a farm. There's my dog. Everything in the field of view was part of our farm. Sweet corn fields in the background. The small building in the foreground is a 2-story structure. It had a wood-burning stove, and that's where I would hang out when I was, by the time I got to high school, and do experiments and my investigations in there. My older brother towing the bike, and the point is, I did not want to remain a farmer. My brother did. He found a way to do it his whole life, and I had other aspirations. So I was interested in becoming an astronaut. Here I am visiting the Vehicle Assembly Building down in Florida while astronauts for the Apollo mission were inside training for it. At the end of high school, I applied to 3 places. I had an early interview at MIT and an early rejection, just a rejection from Northwestern, and Cornell put me on the waiting list. So I know what it's like to be a senior in May and not know if I've been accepted anywhere. They took me off the waiting list, and I earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in physics. I'm the person on the left in this image. It's my mother who's wearing my graduation gown, robes, and my dad there on the right. Right out of undergraduate, I went off to the University of Arizona. I studied planetary sciences, got to look through this telescope, 60-inch diameter. Got kind of burned out on college and decided to get a job. Also, my grades suggested I go look for work. Here I am in the 1980s, working as an aerospace engineer. This is in a hypersonic wind tunnel, and we're carrying out an experiment. While I was an engineer, I still took some continuing education courses at UCI, and I actually met this robot later on when NASA took more of an interest in me. I don't have pictures for this part. I just want to explain that I was pretty content as an aerospace engineer, sort of drifting through my career and life, and I had interactions with someone I highly respected. Really, it really came down to one particular visit at the end of the 1980s, and we were walking along on the beach, actually, a tropical beach, and she wasn't doing so well, and turned to me and said, "Phil, do something." So I never saw her again, but she did change my life, and then I went back to my aerospace engineering job and pondered, what can I do? I just work in this little cubicle. I'm not really much of anyone. I'm sort of at the bottom of the 10-tier totem pole of management. And I just thought about it and decided to try to make a change. What I came up with was, since I was big on the space program, to me it seemed like the space program could be a tool to use for change. So really, the bop to the head is saying, okay, someone sort of changed the direction of my life, or at least suggested to me that I considered becoming actively involved with making the world better. And Mars is the product that I came up with, the tool to use to make the world a better place. So let me get into that a little bit. We have a national identity, and you should recognize that, like right now, we're in sort of a stressful period of time. Really, it's a fluid period of time where maybe we're metamorphosizing into hopefully something better. But there is a national identity, and it's something you have to consider yourself to be part of. This is something I wrote a long time ago, and yet the first sentence is totally appropriate for today. eliminate the pain of living in a society hampered with deep-rooted prejudices. So I want to bring Martians to Earth. There are no Martians at this time, so we have to create the Martians to go to Mars, to come to Earth, to make the changes to our society. Get it? That's it in a nutshell. And we can do this. When we went to the moon, the first Apollo astronauts, the Apollo 11 crew, they were heroes and they were influential and they had a world tour. And then they were retired from NASA. Said, you are a national hero. We're not going to risk letting you fly in space again. Compare that with the biospherians who lived in Biosphere 2. When the space station was first being designed, it was proposed that we build a second Earth as a test bed and see what does it take for people to live in a separate world. That place is called Biosphere 2. It's built out in Arizona. 8 people went into it because that was the original crew size for the International Space Station. And they lived in there for 2 years. And they learned a lot about how to control their environment very directly. What you're seeing is a photograph after they came out, where there was this village in Mexico. They don't have very much water. They had a sewage problem. The biospherians went down there and used their knowledge and skills to create a biologically based waste treatment plant. And what you're looking at is a photograph of the waste treatment facility. And it smells fresh and it's beautiful. And now the village is building tourist attraction hotels and such to view this instead of trying to hide it someplace and say, well, you don't want to see what our sewage plant looks like. Instead, it's something that has made a difference. And these biospherians, even today, they're still out there making a difference out in the real world. So I want to create something where the people who go to Mars and come to Earth aren't just a flash in the pan. Great, you're a hero, and now we're going to ignore you for the rest of your life or not pay much attention to you. But rather, let the Martians come and have lasting influence and involvement with what's going on here on Earth. This slide just says the same thing. It says, okay, there's a nice parade, ticker tape parade for the Apollo 11 astronauts, and my webcam is partially blocking a drawing suggesting that the first real Martians coming to Earth, and by that I mean people who've lived there long enough that we can label them as being a Martian. I'm thinking minimum 4 years, turning in their journals at the Library of Congress, and that was part of the mission. Sorry, my face is blocking the person, the third person in line, but let's move on. So let's talk about the United States for a bit. When the New World was first being colonized, there was and there is to this day, a distinction between how things were set up and operated in North America, excuse me, and how things were set up and operated in South America. So here's kind of iconic images. On the left is a Banderiante, and these are the people who went into Brazil. They were looking for loot and riches and slaves. They went into the jungle, grabbed what they wanted, and then took their wealth generally back with them to Europe. And on the right is a painting of Daniel Boone. Sorry, I'm covering up his name. And it shows a different attitude that we came here to homestead. We've got our family, we've got our hunting dog, we've got our hatchet someplace, I'm sure, and our firearms to settle permanently in this thing. And the attitude has persisted. Here it is more than 400 years later since these two characters lived. And yet, today in Brazil, the attitude about the environment, when I've been there, has been not very caring in general. They take their trash and toss it out the car window while they're driving down the highway and don't think twice about it. Here in the United States, we've had much more growing awareness over the years of environmental activism and involvement in caring more about our permanent home. What am I trying to say here? How things begin is going to influence that society and culture for hundreds of years. Kind of iconically, our pillars here in the United States: First Amendment right, freedom of speech, freedom of worship. Well, you can read these. This is from Norman Rockwell. Freedom from fear. And freedom from want is hidden behind me and my webcam there. Sorry. But basically, we're addressing poverty. And these are issues that we consider to be the bedrock of what it means to be a US citizen. Some of these are under stress right now, but I'll talk about that more in a bit. Here's a mural that I encountered a few years ago while I was north of here, and it shows how settlers have evolved over time along the Columbia River. And it shows a lot of wealth here and all this good stuff. You might notice that the Indian woman is without her partner. Her child is way off on the left, actually, okay, earlier part of the image. But where is the Native American man? Well, we were inevitably going to spread across the United States, but the way that we did it was indeed very brutal and barbaric as far as the Native Americans went. They had a nomadic existence that was dependent on being free-ranging, and we have this mindset that you put up your barbed wire fence and that's your property, and if you're raising sheep and they're raising cattle, then you should fight with each other. So the founding of the United States had problems to start off with. And certainly a major part of that was importing a lot of African slaves to the United States. This is a memorial to them that is in Africa. They did that in South America as well. It wasn't just us. But this is how we started. The White House was built by slave labor. And it's been an issue for more than the 200 years that our country has founded. This is a murder map, and it's from 2015. It's for Oakland. All the dots are where there have been shootings. And the highlight of this particular image, this map, is that if you were to go to Google Maps and zoom in on Piedmont, you'd see these wealthy, spacious homes, and dare I say, reminiscent of some of the homes here in Cerritos. If you go and zoom in on Oakland, it's much more of an urban, compressed environment where you've got a bunch of high-rise apartments, and it just looks visually stunningly different from Piedmont. And what you're seeing in this map is, sure enough, there's this disparity of apparent wealth and a huge disparity in where crime occurs, or where, today the concern is where there's a lot of police enforcement. This murder map is from 2015, but I'm going to exit this PowerPoint right now and go show you today's newspaper. Here's the New York Times. This is June 3rd, 2020, and it's a similar story in this map. The key here says the larger the circle, the larger the number of times that police have used force against Black people per block. The shading represents what percentage of the population is Black. If it's fatal, it's filled in. If it's non-fatal, it's open hold. The big news from a week ago is George Floyd. So here he is on the map. I don't know if I can zoom in on this or not. Probably not. Well, look, I can. So, what's the story? The story is where Black people live, there's much more use of police force. And both sides argue about the significance of the data, but the data is there. This is identical to the chart from 2015 that I showed on the PowerPoint slide. It says there's this imbalance in the United States that's here today, 400 years after, Columbus discovered the New World, 200 years after the founding of our United States. We still have this lingering historical characteristic to who we are as a nation. Let's move on. I like watching Nova on TV. They had an episode now over 3 years ago about the state of the educational system, which I'm a part of, right? I'm trying to teach you this stuff. This inequality is considered the biggest problem in that particular episode that was presented. Even though we're a wealthy nation in our eyes, our poverty rate is much worse than many other developed nations. When you live in poverty, you can't really learn. You're more stressed about safely getting to school, from school, avoiding, trouble, gangs along the route. If you're in a low income area, the odds are kind of stacked against you. There were recent articles about the difference of 8 miles in where you live makes a difference of 30 years in your life expectancy. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, you're gonna make your life expectancy is closer to 60 years. You live in a wealthy neighborhood, your life expectancy is closer to 90 years. And the distance from one neighborhood to the other can be as little as 8 miles or so. So how do we want people involved in building a better future for themselves here, living the American dream, if they can't embrace that vision, having to deal with all the stresses in their immediate environment? Okay, I've made this point already, but here are a couple slides to reinforce it. The United States was founded by people like Daniel Boone, and that mindset has persisted for hundreds of years, that we're rugged individualists, that we go out into the wilderness and we build a better future for ourselves. This image is just making the point that if you were to send a football team to Mars as the first settlers, that will be the dominant culture of the Martians for 400, 500 years. If you send the cheerleader squad to Mars as the first residents, the first Martians, that will be the dominant culture of the Martians for the next several centuries at least. So this begs the question, what kind of culture do you want the Martians to be? And so here's my sentence on that. We, United States people, generally want people to match our ideals of who we try to be. Think of our four freedoms. Think of our rugged individualism. Now, jumble all that together, and here's a sentence. They should be free, Martians should be free from major prejudices. And I added this last one differently from earlier versions of this PowerPoint, including financial wealth. This is sort of a new thought on my part based on the events of the past 3 months. We don't care too much about this, but if you want, you can pause the slide and read it. So based on just my own observations and thoughts, how many people does it take to create a stable Martian culture? And what can we do? So here's some data I generated that says in about 18 years, that's the punchline that's hidden by my webcam. In about 18 years, not using the huge new ships that SpaceX is trying to develop where you put 100 colonists up there at a time, but the versions where you can put maybe 6 people on board a ship at a time. Factoring everything in, it looks like in less than 2 decades, we could have a stable Martian culture, stable Martian society inhabiting Mars. And so if we make that effort for 2 decades of establishing a group of people who are closer to the ideal that we aspire to, they're anchored. And that will be the seed from which the Martian civilization will grow. This is just a chart saying the same thing. Look, it's not going to be a one-way trip of people going to Mars and staying there. That's the green line, people going to Mars. The red line is people coming from Mars to Earth. So there is going to be people who choose to stay there for relatively short times. There's going to be people who choose to settle there. I don't restrict the first Martian as being the first person born on Mars. We don't need to wait that long before we have Martians coming to Earth. You know, I went to college for 4 years, so I'm a Cornellian. Okay, well, maybe a Martian is someone who lives on Mars for 4 years or 6 years. They have criteria in Alaska. How long does it take to live in Alaska before you're considered an Alaskan? Right? Same thing we could do for Mars. Of course, I'm trying to make structural changes to United States society or culture. And one of the tools I'm trying to use is enticing students to become better educated. Of course. So one part of that plan is to set up scholarships. So if you're a person graduating from college, you can take a battery of exams, and if you do well, you get scholarships to earn up to 2 additional master's degrees, let's say, or 3 total, preferably in different subjects. So maybe music would be one of them. And sure, science and technology is the other 2. The kind of people we need on Mars should not be prima donnas in one field. PhDs who are so super specialized that you can't touch their cell phone to move it someplace without them freaking out. We need the phrases jack of all trades, master of none. We need people who have a much broader preparation for developing a new society on Mars. And so, as the chart suggests, you know, even if you don't pass the exam and earn the scholarship, we could at least offer you a job in the preparation part here on Earth. I work with high school students, and from my point of view, that's part of a progression that says, all right, well, when you're first starting out in life, we can talk to you about going to Mars someday, starting the skill of keeping a journal so we know who you are as you grow up, noting your environment. I've taken students on field trips outside of the state of California as part of this. The best of you then have to go and become qualified as astronauts to actually get to Mars, but not just NASA astronauts. This is sort of like the level above that, the colonist level, not just the astronauts. Astronauts work for NASA, they do their jobs. Colonists have this different objective. And the idea is you go to Mars and you learn to care for life better. Maybe from Earth, we bring up some life that's endangered here, isolated on Mars. I know, different gravity, different environment, but maybe you can help figure out a better way of caring for them and bringing that knowledge back to Earth. So really that's the third phase. Notice there's 3 columns here. Most people, when they talk about going to Mars, there's no third column. They talk about, oh, we should go set up a colony on Mars. Well, that's insufficient to get anyone on Earth interested in it. If you want to send people to Mars, it better be to help make life better on Earth. And so a key idea of my whole Mars concept is to bring people from Mars to Earth, ambassadors, mentors, educators, civil servants, people who aren't going to just enjoy a parade, say, wow, hey, you walked on Mars, but people who roll up their sleeves and become permanently immersed in the affairs of Earth, wherever they're welcome to come. Some images I took over the years. Here's a group of us, science teachers actually, writing in our journals and learning about the Earth physically. So this was a field trip to Devil's Postpile. Part of the same tour, learning about glaciation in Yosemite. Off you go to Mars, and you use your skills to look for life, among other things. Here's a long story, and I know this video is already too long, so I will pass on this and suggest that if you go on YouTube, there is a video that I've done with Mr. Jernigan, and I'll try to leave a reference to it. If you look up Philip Tuerek, Bringing Martians to Earth, they had misspelled my name. You'll see a presentation I've done with Mr. Jernigan in the Washington, D.C. area in 2016. So let's skip this a little bit, skip that. The stuff I care about, just blowing through it. You, high school students, can make significant changes. Okay, this one I feel like I have to talk about. When the first Martians come to Earth, they might be quarantined the same way the Apollo 11 astronauts were first quarantined. And that's an opportunity for Congress to become productively involved with this whole program. What the red lines represent are the Amtrak train routes of the United States. And my webcam is covering up an image of a family on board an Amtrak train studying the routes. The 2 children are blocked by my webcam. The girl is, I think, writing in her journal, and the boy is playing with some like measurement gadget, we'll say scientific measurement gadget. And the family as a group is adding their voice to the population and saying, well, I think you should, the Martians should travel this route, Route A or Route B. Somehow I would say that they should at least pass through the cornfields of Iowa, that the trip should end at Union Station in Washington, D.C., that it's representative of our form of government, that Congress would debate and determine the route traveled by the Martians when they first come to Earth. So let me tell you a bit about what I've done in my life, right? So there I am in the middle. That's my former congressman now, off on the right, and a co-founder with me. So there were actually 6 of us, and we created the Space Society that I was involved with one of the officers. So just like here at school, you've got the president, the vice president. I was a secretary. I actually did meet Buzz Aldrin at his home. He invited me down when he learned about my ideas, my vision, and he wanted to compare notes with me. He basically approved of my concept. He said NASA astronaut headquarters would not really be in favor of my plan, but that it was a good plan anyways, and I should pursue it. a list of some of the papers I presented. Again, my webcam is covering up Mr. Jernigan's name, and that's the one you could find on YouTube. Took 2 years, 8 months, but I went from aerospace engineer to high school science teacher. I've taken students on trips and had them do some simulated exploration of Earth. So the idea is you students learn about Earth very well, learn about our culture here on Earth, all as preparation for you going to Mars someday, so that when you come back to Earth, people aren't afraid of you because they will know who you are for your whole life. What I do want to share with you is that I had the pleasure of being in a simulated Mars base for 2 weeks in the early 2000s. Here is some biography about my crewmates. So Sini was a planetary scientist, and she's into racing. I'm laughing because I let her drive my car for part of the trip, and that was exhilarating. Dusty was a retired NASA engineer who liked to fly gyrocopters. Derek was from Canada. This was, I believe, his engagement photo. Ed was a mechanical engineer. Sarah from Rutgers. And the sixth crew member was me. This is crew 8 at the Mars Desert Research Station in Hanksville, Utah. And for 2 weeks, we lived in that simulated Mars base behind us. Sarah didn't last the 2 weeks. And I had shown up wondering, how am I going to contribute to this crew? Who am I? I'm just a high school teacher now. But once she was no longer with us, I was emergency trained to take over her duties, which involved monitoring the wastewater management system, making sure it's sterilizing our gray water and such, and maintaining the water regeneration systems. So, new task, and I was useful. I would say I discovered my usefulness was kind of as the glue that would make different individuals say, oh, yeah, okay. I'd tag along and hang out, and that would sort of inspire them to, okay, let's go do this right now. Let's go do that. So I'm not really a skilled person in one sense, but I'm a useful person as far as how the overall team went. Image of where we were, out in the middle of nowhere. We didn't have reliable internet communication in those days, so we had to go to town on occasion. We got to use ATVs. We did some explorations. We set a few records, or at least one I know of. And now I want to share with you. So that bop I had to my head was at the end of the 1980s. And right away, I hired artists and tried to express myself with PowerPoint slides. So here's a sketch from Chris Butler from the early 1990s, let's say. And it shows, here's someone who goes to Mars. They're contemplating the Earth as they look out the window. Well, here's the counterpart picture I took of Derek at the Mars Desert Research Station, gazing out the window. And you can kind of see it's a cluttered place that we lived in. Very tight quarters, 2-story structure. You can look it up online. Now you can take a virtual tour of it as well. The new advanced one compared to when I was there. An image from the past about how you learn about Earth life on Earth. You go to Mars and you carry out the same skills. So Chris had created this sketch of someone on Mars using a microscope. Well, here's a photo I took of Dusty, and he's at his telescope. He was surveying a site. Now there's an entire robotic observatory located where he recommended that they place it. So I was there, 18 years ago now, and the place has evolved considerably since my days there. Remember, I was crew 8. Now they're up in the hundreds. A drawing of space cadets trying to, combine education with the allure of going into space. This is me in my simulated spacesuit there at the Mars Desert Research Station. Another Chris Butler drawing of a sketch of, the Martians watching sunsets on Mars. Okay, well, here's a photo I took of our shadows. We're in our spacesuits at the research station, having fun. So that was 2 weeks, and they picked me. I can apply for the year-long mission if I were qualified. They have them now up in the Arctic, and there's several places you can look it up at the Mars Society. But here back at our school, along with Mr. Jernigan and Mr. Boschman, we created Astronomy Night and set up the aerospace engineering course that I teach. So I've done stuff. I'm sharing with you my own ideas. I'm going to now talk a little bit about what I think you can do, sprinkled with still some closing thoughts on my part for things that are going on today, right? June 2020. You can become a hero. You've had this time at home and you're feeling like, oh, you're missing out on life. Think of it as being you're in your cocoon now. You went in as a caterpillar, you can come out as a butterfly, you can change and become someone influential in a positive way. And we need you like that right now. Public service is a dirty word for a lot of people. The government is not to be trusted. A lot of people will tell you that. It's one of the reasons why we need good people to consider becoming civil servants. Something called the Peter Principle. This is advice from me. So this guy wrote a book, these two people, and my webcam is covering now, but it says, when you're working someplace, if you're really good at your job, you'll get promoted. And if you're doing your promotion well enough, eventually you'll get promoted again. Well, you're only going to rise to the level where you become so incompetent that you would not get promoted any higher. They wrote this book as sort of a satire, but it's embraced as a correct idea by a lot of people that says, yeah, that's about right. You're good at something, you get promoted. If you're not good at it, you don't get promoted. So eventually the entire hierarchy in a corporation is basically the top people are all incompetent. And think of it that way for a moment. It's kind of humorous. I don't know if it's really true, but I've heard of a study that said as your pay is increased, your work quality output doesn't keep up with the pay increase. I'm not sure if I should say it goes down, but it doesn't keep up with the amount of your pay increase. So if you think backwards, then logically, it's the people who aren't getting paid who do the best work. And you really should consider connecting with volunteer nonprofit organizations. There are several springing up this week dealing with current events. But beyond that, there are thousands upon thousands of nonprofit volunteer groups for any topic under the sun. A quilting group. I'm rolling my eyes. I'm trying to remember. I had a particular interest in certain groups, and so I targeted them, but it's been so long, I can't even prattle off examples of them. I do remember going to the library and finding volumes of book, very thick, with many, 1,000 pages plus in each book, in tiny 10-point font, listing the name of a nonprofit group and the contact information for it. And okay, there's the Nature Society, there's Toastmasters, there's a lot of groups out there where the individuals do really good work. And you should, be aware of that at the least. So think of it this way too. There's 40 million unemployed people in the United States right now. They've been cooped up at stay at home for months. A major social issue has become prominent, and they're energizing. And this is really a good thing. They have the time because they're unemployed, essentially. No one's paying them to do this. They can make the effort to do things right. This is new for me, new thought. Really, outcome of watching the events here in the United States for the past 3 or so months. So I'm kind of reaching the conclusion that we're in a plutocracy, which means it's really the really wealthy people who are controlling our government more than we think we should like. Seems kind of verifiable that most senators are millionaires. Well, 47% in one article, so almost half of them are millionaires. One thing I liked about the country of Japan, a decade ago when I worked in aerospace, I heard, so it's an urban myth, that the ratio of the top paying person to the lowest paying person in a given company was no more than 10 to 1. And here's a chart from 2011 to 12 showing the top CEO in the United States is like 350 to the person at the bottom of the pay scale. It's just way the heck out of line. From my point of view, when I was growing up, I thought of if I earn $1 million in my lifetime, then that's about the sum total of my pay over all this time. It's adjusted a little bit due to inflation, but if my thinking had been, if I earn $1 million over my life and I live a reasonably comfortable life, right? I'm not out on the street, I'm not starving, I have a roof over my head, then what would I do with $10 million in my life? And I sort of think of it as, well, that's like living 10 people's lifetimes worth of income. So maybe one person wants to do flying, maybe another person wants to do something or other. And so I think of each $1 million as being like a lifetime's worth of income. When you get up to $350 million, that's 350 lifetimes. That's more than you can reasonably justify for the 349 people whose income you've accumulated to spend on yourself. I know it's an odd way of thinking of it, but from my point of view, there's an upper limit to how much practical wealth you accumulate, beyond which I would have to say there might be this runaway effect like what we're seeing in the US Senate right now, where you become focused strictly on making even more money. I mean, if you consider the needs of conservative billionaires, they are strongly represented in our Congress these days, much, much more so than the values of all the rest of us. So I view wealth as being not a good indicator for someone to become a good public servant. I think of it as you're just too disconnected from the rest of us. I mean, we have a lot of people in the United States below the poverty level, at the poverty level. Think of that as your lowest paid employee in your company. In Japan, it's a ratio of 10 to 1. I'm tossing out a number that says, well, I know in the United States, we have so many people who feel like money is everything. If if we capped it at 10-to-1 ratio, that's just not going to fly. So where my webcam is maybe I shouldn't tell you. But I put a number there, I typed it, and now my webcam is covering it up. But I did pick a number greater than 10-to-1 ratio as a suggestion, at least for the Martian society, is an objective that says they don't need to deal with the difficulties that we deal with when we have the super, super rich who are focused on making themselves more money, uncaring about what happens to all the rest of us, in a sense. If we don't have that huge of an imbalance, if it's a smaller ratio, and I'll say like in Japan it was 10-to-1, they're still connected, they still relate, they still understand, they're not attributed with something they don't have either. We've been starting to attribute, say, well, if you're rich, then you must be a genius, you must be all these other things, and that might not be true. You got lucky, you won the lottery. Great, doesn't make you a genius. But we tend to associate wealth with power a great deal. How about we put some sort of cap on wealth for people who are trying to at least be in public service? Maybe across all of Martian society would be good. But these are things for you students to think about and work on. Consider the book of Elijah, which is a joke, meaning I have a student, his name is Elijah. I hope he writes a book expressing his political views and his ideas. Here's some don'ts. This is my own input suggestion to you students. Here are things that are challenges for us today in the United States. These are things that you should avoid doing yourself. We have two main political parties, and sort of one side of each line is one political party, and the other side is the other political party. So one group says, we're all sticking together, and the other group says, well, then, you're being afraid of outsiders coming in. And one group says, well, we should follow our leader no matter what our leader says. And the other group says, well, you're saying that's a dictator, and I don't want to follow a dictator. And so one group says, okay, so you can kind of figure this out. So there's really three lines here, right? Think about it as stuff that needs, and puritanical is the word covered by my webcam. Some of the issues facing the Martians that you guys can figure out. How do you deal with violence on Mars? Immigration. They have a tremendous labor shortage on Mars right now. There's no one up there. And if there were people, they'd be employed full-time building a Martian society, right? So environmental protection is a whole kettle of worms, bucket of worms, something, can of worms at least, about what if there's life on Mars, indigenous life on Mars? How do we know that it's not been imported from Earth without our knowledge over the centuries and centuries that there's been material exchanging between Earth and Mars through asteroids and meteors and volcanic eruption that lands on Earth or lands on Mars? The part that's new for me this year, our educational system has a formal process to get accreditation. And when you have accreditation, it means, yes, you are providing these basic services and to this much quality. We get evaluated every finite period of time. And what I have come up with as a new idea for this school year is taking this idea of WASC, Western Association of Schools and Colleges is what they call it here on the West Coast, for getting schools accredited, and they have levels for lower level schools, secondary schools, and colleges as well. Schools and colleges, get it? Well, taking that concept and applying it to governments on Earth. I would love for Elijah and the rest of you to design a decent Martian government and think of it as one of the components that would go into a WASC type evaluator system. So WASC for here, Cerritos means principals and teachers from surrounding schools plus one or two core people come as a visitation committee. And they spend several days on campus interviewing students and parents and teachers and touring around, inspecting classrooms, inspecting the program, evaluating and confirming that everything that we did in our own self-study is valid. And then pointing out stuff we might not have noticed about ourselves. We're blind about something, or maybe, praising that, hey, you actually did better on this than what you thought. I think it'd be useful to have something like that structure for governments, where the Martian government is just part of an accreditation visiting committee. And sometimes, it's representatives from the Martian government, along with the rest of our neighbors, the same way it's done for Cerritos High School. Some of our neighbors, not all of our neighbors. The accreditation committee is limited to just, let's say half a dozen people. Same thing might be true for a government evaluation committee. So think of half a dozen or so individuals from various governments, including a Martian government as part of this mix, who come to the United States once every periodic period of time and confirm our own self-study that says, well, we're providing this, our government is doing what a government should do. And in our case, we declare that our government should be protecting our people and upholding our Constitution and, treating all people as equal, ... How are we doing? What's our progress like on that? It gets sticky if we try to apply our values to some other government, right? So let's say, pick a country. If they're part of this evaluation process, they have perhaps a very, very different concept of what their government should do. And so they get evaluated by that criteria for that country. We're not trying to impose our government and values on other countries, heaven forbid at this point. But we can definitely use some outside objective evaluation about what kind of progress we're making as a society, as a government. I think that, here's my last slide. Often when people talk about going to Mars, they think of it as being like the Apollo program of my generation, where you send a ship up and the government employee plants a flag and you take pictures of their footprints and you collect a few rocks and you say, we've done Mars. It's not what I'm interested in. Sure, I understand that astronauts will go to Mars first, but I'm really focused on the Martians that I want to bring to Earth. Here is an image from a few years back of the science department. Some of the faces have changed since this photo was taken, but we're a diverse, cohesive group. We embrace many different aspects of American culture and society in our ranks. We work well together. You can create a Martian civilization that works well together, plays well with others. I think that's a goal that is worthy of effort. Okay, I've talked way too long. Good luck. Ciao.